And did you perform an autopsy on somebody identified to you as Sasha Samsudean?
I did.
When did you perform that autopsy?
I'm going to refer to a copy of my autopsy protocol, which indicates that the examination was performed on October the 19th, 2015 at 9 a.m.
All right, and can you take us through this process of doing the autopsy? What is the first step that you take?
Well, in this case, the body was x-rayed even before the body bag was opened. Then, because of the circumstances surrounding the death, based on the scene photographs that I observed, I felt that this case was most likely a homicide and probably strangulation. And in cases of homicide, especially with strangulation, we will look for trace evidence. That involves examining the body, gowned and gloved to maintain as much of a sterile environment as possible. And in this case, an alternate light source instrument was used to look for fluid stains on the body. None were noted, although there were some fibers in the groin area that were collected. Then swabs were obtained from the neck area, the hands, the rectum, the vagina, the mouth, and the breasts. These are saline-soaked swabs. They look just like a Q-tip, and the skin is rubbed with these, and those swabs are then collected, labeled, and submitted to a laboratory for analysis. Following that, the body is photographed to document injuries. Then the internal examination commences, which is a opening of the body, a removal of the organs, paying particular attention to evidence of injury or disease processes. Following that, blood and urine, if present, are collected, as well as certain tissue, and submitted for toxicology to look for evidence of drugs or alcohol. Following that, a report is compiled and an opinion is rendered.
Did you receive toxicology reports in this case?
Yes.
And did they indicate anything as to ethanol level at the time of passing?
Yes, the ethanol level was, I believe it was a 0.229 grams per deciliter.
And to my understanding, if you were asked about the effects of ethanol on people, you would say that it's different for different people. Is that fair?
Yes.
But is there anything you can generally say about 0.229 as an ethanol level in a human being?
I'd say that you could describe her as drunk.
Were there any controlled substances found in her blood?
No.
All right. And as part of what you do in forming opinions about cause and manner of death, do you also rely upon photographs that are taken at the scene by a medical examiner or investigator?
Yes.
And perhaps, if you described it, forgive me, but do you actually go out to the scene, or does an investigator go out to the scene?
In our office, most of the time it is an investigator that goes to the scene, not the physician.
And is the autopsy process, both the external and the internal part of the autopsy, is that documented by photograph?
It is.
And would that help you explain to the jury what you did?
Yes.
All right, doctor, what are we looking here at image 60?
Well, this is the deceased as she was received in the body bag and a plastic shroud. The bag has been opened now. You can see that there's also some bedding that accompanies the body. You can see that there's an identification card here there on her chest. And you can see that there is some clothing. There is a bra and there's a blouse that is partially on. It actually has been torn. And you can see abrasion. Abrasion is a...
For the record, doctor, can you also say where on her body you see this bruising and abrasions, and then explain abrasions?
I'm looking at the upper chest and the lower neck area. An abrasion is a superficial injury. So if you fall and scrape your knee, that's an abrasion. Contusion is a bruise. They're both types of blunt force trauma. Now, and you can see here this fine network of those are actually blood vessels. This is a sign of early decomposition. That's not an injury. These are injuries. These are contusions and these are abrasions.
And can you explain contusion?
Contusion is a bruise, blunt force injury to the skin produces injury to small blood vessels, which release blood. Under the surface of the skin, usually they're bluish, and then, as you know, as time goes by, they age. These all appear to have occurred right about the time of death. Also, in this picture, you can see on her face some small blood vessels have ruptured. These are called petechial hemorrhages. And there's more of them in her eyelids and on the eyes themselves.
Do you have an opinion as to what may have caused those petechial hemorrhages?
Well, in this case, they're caused by strangulation. She had compression of the neck, which causes a buildup of blood pressure in small vessels. Because usually what happens is the carotid arteries are not compressed, but the veins that drain the blood from the head are compressed. So blood is going into the head, it's not draining, and these small, fragile blood vessels will rupture. It can happen to any of us too, it doesn't have to be a fatal injury. But it's frequently seen in manual strangulation, in almost all cases.
Do you suspect anything about the fluid seen at her nostril?
She has some bloody mucus coming from the nose. It is not unusual in cases of manual strangulation for a person to have blood coming from their nose, and even rarely from their ears.
Is there any suspected blood on any of the bedding in this image?
There is. There is some blood stain that you can see here on the comforter. That's not, I think that's not a pure blood. I think that's a mixture of blood and fluid. Fluid will build up in the lungs and come out through the nose.
Now, in image 61, let's talk about what is new to this image. What is on her right hand? And do you see any external injury on her right arm or forearm?
Yes. Well, first of all, you can see that she's, this is the way the body was received and the way she was found, actually. You can see that the left arm is behind the body. We're looking now at the chest and the mid portion of the torso. The hands are bagged in paper. This is something that investigators do at the scene to preserve evidence. And then you can see some small abrasions here on her right arm. And again, this marbling is a little bit more pronounced in this picture. That is a sign of decomposition. However, I would point out that a person decomposes more rapidly from areas of injury. And that's why I see decomposition change more prominent here in the neck, because there's an injury there. Whereas the rest of the skin looks like...
If you could...
preserve evidence. And then you can see some small abrasions here on her right arm. And again, this marbling is a little bit more pronounced in this picture. That is a sign of decomposition. However, I would point out that a person decomposes more rapidly from areas of injury. And that's why I see decomposition change more prominent here in the neck, because there's an injury there. Whereas the rest of the skin looks like...
if you could stand more towards the edge of the television to see the jurors. Or do you want to stand on the other side?
I could.
Perfect.
The pointer, I think, doesn't register on the screen.
Okay.
For whatever reason, so I'll have to just use my hand. So again, as I was saying, this area of marbling, we call that, this network, it almost looks like blood vessels. That's decomposition, that's not an injury. But the fact that she's starting to decompose more here in the neck area indicates that that's related to the trauma.
All right, image 62, is there any sign of external injury that we haven't discussed?
Yes, now we're looking at the lower abdomen, the genitals, and the anterior thighs, and you can see some small contusions or bruises on both sides of both legs.
And any particular area on the thighs?
They appear to be more toward the middle area of the thighs, but there are some on the lateral areas.
Anything new as far as external trauma, and can you describe what are on her feet in image 63?
The feet are back, similar to the hands, to preserve evidence. There's a small contusion here below the knee, a small contusion on the left knee, and you can see again the small contusions or bruises on the arm.
Now, sometimes people ask if you can date or age bruises. What do you have to say about that?
I won't do it. You can usually say that a group of bruises appear to be contemporaneous. That is, they appear to be the same age. When you see yellowish cast to a bruise, in general, it indicates that the bruise is a little bit older. However, I've seen some bruises that I know are fresh, that occurred about the time of death, do have a slight grayish yellowish hue. So in general, it's not a recommended practice to attempt to age a contusion or a bruise. However, you can usually see that the bruises or contusions are all about the same age.
And what can you say so far about what we've seen about the contusions in this case? Can you say anything about their contemporaneousness to each other or to the time of death?
I think they all appear to be consistent with being sustained about the time of death. However, we know from time to time we all fall into something. I can't say for certain that this contusion isn't something that occurred earlier in the evening.
Particularly if she's intoxicated and said to be walking about?
Correct.
All right. And did you actually do any microscopic slides of areas where she had contusions or abrasions?
I did.
And what's the purpose of doing that?
She had some curious abrasions on her buttocks and thighs that I could not, I was not certain of what caused them. And I wanted to see if there was any possibility that these were things that had occurred earlier. And one of the ways to do that, although it's not 100% reliable, is to take a microscopic section of that skin and see if there's some inflammation there. In this case, I did not see any.
Why would you look for inflammation?
Well, if a person has an injury, inflammatory cells will migrate to that injury to initiate the healing process. Unfortunately, that is not always the case, but certainly after a certain period of time, probably several hours, you would expect to see some of these inflammatory cells in the skin. In this case, I didn't see it.
Is that a process that ceases when the body dies?
For the most part, although you do have to be careful, there are reports of, particularly in neck injuries, there are reports of people taking sections from people who were known to not be injured, who died from another reason. In sections of areas of the neck, you show what looks like inflammation, and it is assumed that that is a post-mortem phenomenon.
Looking at image 64, what can you tell us about what you see externally here?
So we're looking at predominantly the inner left thigh, the vulva, and the buttocks. And these are, this discoloration of the skin here, which was present in this body in almost any place there was skin-to-skin contact. And I believe that that is an early decomposition change. This reddish area here, going down the inner thigh, is an abrasion. That's an injury It looks like a vital injury. It doesn't have the appearance of a postmortem abrasion. Postmortem abrasions tend to be more orange in color rather than red. This looks deep red in color. I believe that is an abrasion that occurred, injury, washables.
You use the word vital. Can you just explain that?
A vital just indicates that the tissue was living, the person was living when the injury was.
And are there any contusions visible on her left thigh in this image, or other injuries?
There's a small contusion here below this abrasion. A small contusion here. You can see a small vague contusion there on the inner thigh.
And can you opine as to whether or not those injuries would be consistent with perhaps having intercourse with somebody who had like a utility or security belt on?
That is one possibility.
All right, in image 65, what new is there to talk about?
This is the same view of the inner thighs and the genital region. And again, you can see this color change here in the skin. It's very symmetrical, and that's what I'm seeing on her body. Anywhere there was skin-to-skin contact, including her back and her arm. Remember, I told you her arm was behind her back. I saw the same change there, and the same change occurred in the underarms. I don't see any other injury here. There's a small fiber here. Probably a piece of cloth.
And by a piece of cloth, clothing, like
Clothing,
bath towel?
A terry cloth robe.
Okay.
She was partially under. I couldn't say what the source of it.
I was going to ask you, was that white thing underneath her a white robe?
It is.
And that's terry cloth?
It is.
Now, when the body was presented to you, did it have any odor?
Well, yes. It did have the odor of what I would describe as a cleaning solution. Not necessarily a bleach odor, although there appeared to be bleach stains on the comforter. It was more of what I would describe as a cleaning solution.
And can those chemicals, or just the wetness of a liquid chemical, does that have any effect on the things that you're talking about changed with her skin, if it's wet as opposed to dry?
I think so. I think that was the reason that we're seeing these changes, especially in areas where there was skin-to-skin contact, where the liquid would not evaporate because the skin was sealing it. And I think that's the reason that I'm seeing this changes.
And so those changes at the skin folds of her legs to her torso, is that what you're talking about, those changes?
Correct.
Anything new to talk about as far as external injuries in 66?
Yeah.
All right, and what are you doing here in 67, and what are we seeing?
Now I'm looking at the vulva, and I'm looking for evidence of trauma. I'm looking for evidence of injury to the vulva and vagina. Now, in this case, as I said, she started to decompose, and especially in areas where there's skin-to-skin contact. And the vulva is, and coitus of the vagina is one of those areas where there is skin-to-skin contact. And you can see that just in the process of opening here, you can see that the superficial skin surface is being pulled away. So I can't say for sure whether there is an injury here. I can say that there could be an injury that's obscured by the early decomposition change.
Now, in non-consensual sexual intercourse with an adult sexually active female, is injury necessary?
No.
And can you explain that to the jury?
Well, there are many cases of rape that are recorded, followed by a sexual assault exam in living individuals, and they do not all have injuries to the vaginal mucosa. I can't completely rule out an injury here. I don't want to say there's an injury, though, because of the condition of the tissue in this region.
But no injury to the vagina or in the area surrounding it is not inconsistent with a history of sexual battery. Is that fair?
That's correct.
What are we looking at here in 68?
This is the right foot and ankle.
Any signs of external trauma to talk about?
I don't believe
And in 69, is that the bottom of her right foot?
It is.
Any signs of trauma?
No.
Bottom of her left foot in 70, any signs of trauma?
No.
Is there any discoloration going on there, and can you describe what it is to the jury if there is?
Well, she has some yellowish discoloration of the skin over the heel and the first metatarsal joint, the ball. That's common in the callus condition.
And in 71, is that the top of her left foot and ankle?
It is.
Any signs of external trauma?
I don't believe so. There's some impression that the bag has left on the first foot.
And if you were to, I know you mentioned swabbing several areas that seem consistent with the sexual assault exam, but did you also take swabs from her wrists and ankles in this case?
Yes.
All right. And at what point in this process would you be doing that?
That would be after the x-rays were taken, but before most of the photographs would have been taken. So what happens is, this is usually done in the x-ray suite, where we have an alternate light source device. We will relook at the body using a filtered light and filtered goggles to see if there's any evidence of fluid stains. We're looking for saliva or semen primarily on the skin surface. In this case, we did not see any, but we swabbed the areas where it would have been suspected that there was skin contact.
And can you just flesh out the alternate light source and what sorts of body fluids can be seen with that for the jury?
Yeah, so what we're doing is, normally when you have a light, it's a what they call full spectrum light, a white light. There are devices which can limit the spectrum to ultraviolet light or blue light primarily, about, I think it's 540 or 440 is the spectrum. And in this case, normally you would expect semen or in some cases saliva to fluoresce or to look different in the surrounding skin surface when using this alternate light source. And those are areas then that you would want to swab. In this case, I didn't see any. But we swabbed the usual areas, which would include the vulva and the vagina. Breasts. The neck area, where I saw evidence of what I consider to be anal strangulation, and as well as the wrist and ankles.
And do you do anything with her fingernails?
Yes, the fingernails, during the swabbing of the hands, which I do personally, the fingernails are also swabbed, and then the fingernails are cut very close and submitted to the laboratory.
And when you say you swabbed her breasts, where do the breast swabs specifically come from?
Well, it's primarily the nipple and areola area, but also the skin surrounding that throat.
And in 72, what are we looking at, and is there any signs of external trauma?
I'm not sure what we're looking at there.
All right.
It may just be bloody fluid that's collected.
All right, 73.
Now we're looking at her right hand and wrist area, and you can see a small area of darker skin there, and it's a bruise.
Indeed. You called that a bruise as opposed to being a sign of decomposition, and can you explain how?
Well, sometimes that's just a judgment call, but normally you don't see a color change in decomposition that would look like that. I mean, it's a focal, roughly circular area of discoloration. So that's not typical.
Circular area of contusion, is that consistent with being grabbed by somebody?
It is, although there are a number of ways you can have a bruise like that.
Okay. And in 74, is this her right hand in a ring?
It is.
Was there anything there with the ring?
There was a hair in the ring, which was.
And in 75, is this a closer up of what we were talking about 2 slides back in 73?
It is. You can see what I would call an ill-defined area of bruising there, and a more linear area of bruising there.
76, any signs of injury here?
I think not. You see at the base of the thumb here this discoloration, which appears to be a bruise. I see that frequently. So I wouldn't say that was.
All right, and in 77, it looks like the left hand and wrist. Is there any signs of external trauma here?
There are some darkened areas over the knuckles. I can't say that those are actually contusions.
And what are we looking at in 78?
We are looking at the left side, extreme left side of her hip and thigh, as well as her left arm. And now you can see, remember the left arm was behind the body. You can see this skin. Now this top surface, the pigmented layer of the skin, is coming off. That's a classic sign of decomposition. You'll also see something like that in an individual who is where the skin is moist, if they're in an environment where it's very warm. In a very short period of time, you'll see a change like that. Here in Central Florida, we frequently see that in an individual who, for whatever reason, dies and is left on hot pavement for just a short period of time. That's called skin slippage, and that is not an injury. That is something that occurs.
And what about this white thing in the center of the image? Was that something that was collected with her body?
Yes, there was a tissue there in the comforter with the body.
And you were talking about temperature. Does your medical examiner's office try to estimate a time of death?
Well, in some cases we do, but it's a very difficult thing to do by examining the body, and the longer a person's been dead, the more likely it is that your estimation of the interval is going to be wrong. So usually what we do is we look at the circumstances. For instance, when was the person last known to be alive, and when were they found, and is the body in general consistent with that? I don't attempt to determine the time of death, and most of my people in practice forensic pathology in the real world.
That's what I was getting at, like looking at the temperature of the room and if the air conditioning is on. Can you explain whether that's reality or television?
Well, here's what happens. So you can do a temperature, you can do a temperature of the body, and there are calculations that you can perform, and you can adjust with the clothing and the ambient temperature and the body mass. And in the real world, if it agrees with what you already know to be true, then it could be accepted. However, frequently it doesn't, and so we discard it because we know it's not reliable. And therefore, if it's not reliable, it really doesn't have any place in our society. So,
What are we looking at in 79?
this is the comforter, and you can see a portion of the bathrobe there, and then you can see a bloody fluid stain on the comforter. You can also see some areas of discoloration, which I described as bleach stain.
80?
Same thing. Now you can see more of the comforter. You can see some of those areas that appear to be bleached out in the bathroom.
81?
Same.
82?
Now this is I think the inner aspect of the comforter. This is a more dense blood stain. I'll just say that we saw that was I would consider to be bloody fluid stain. It's not pure blood. This is what's more like a blood stain, predominantly blood.
All right, now at some processes, part of the process is the body cleaned up.
Yes.
And what does that mean?
Well, when there's any blood involved, it can obscure an injury. So after we photograph the body as it's received, we clean them. clean the body. In some cases, you actually have to scrub to remove dry secretions or blood.
All right, and now I see there's like a blue background. Is this part of the process of having cleaned the body and now taking another step in the autopsy?
Yes, now we're photographing the hands. And that is you're right, that is a blue background. There should be a blue background in those blue.
And so now, starting with 83, the body's been cleaned?
I believe so.
And looking at her left hand in 83, is there any signs of external injury that you didn't tell us about earlier that was now visible? Okay. 84, left hand, can you describe the discoloration there?
Yes, there is some discoloration of the skin here, and you can see it sort of has an alternating light and dark pattern, and that's an indication of morbidity. That is something that occurs when a body dies, when a person dies. The blood will settle by gravity. Now, any area of the skin that is compressed by clothing or bedclothes will tend to not produce liner. So you can see that this area here, I think, is consistent with the bedding. So, and probably to some extent the bags that were placed on the hands.
Is that consistent with the pressure of her upper body being on top of her left arm that was pinned behind her?
Yes.
And in 85, kind of the pinky knife edge of the left hand, is there anything new?
Yeah.
86, anything new?
Yes. We can see here on the wrist of the left hand this abrasion. Small abrasions, about an inch. So, and that's an injury. It's it appears to be the same age as the rest of the injuries on the shoulder.
Anything new in 87?
Yeah.
88? 89?
No.
90? 91?
Here on this photograph with the ring, you can see the hair that was in the ring.
Is that by the pointer?
It is.
92, what is this?
This is her left ear. You can see she has some maturity in her earlobe. It appears that she has some, still has some moist fluid on the side of her face.
93?
That is the right ear. You can see she does have one stud and another piercing. You can also see some of these reddish dots. These are petechial hemorrhages that are described here.
94?
This is a necklace that was actually not around her neck, but was tangled in her hair, and I believe it was also broken. Then you can also see her blouse, which had been torn, but was still on her arms.
And is that black thing a bra strap underneath her shirt?
It is. And then you can also see here, this is a contusion, this is a bruise here. That's on her upper chest, and you can see an abrasion here, more abrasion here in the lower neck, large area of bruising there.
Is that a curved abrasion at the top right of this image?
Yes, here, these abrasions are semi-lunar, semicircular abrasions.
Are they consistent with fingernails?
They are.
And in 95, is that a close-up of the necklace?
It is.
And is there more of that blood mucousy fluid there too?
Yes.
96, is that a close-up of the ring in the hair?
Yes.
97, her necklace?
Correct.
98, the end of the necklace?
It is.
99, the clasp end of it?
Yes.
What are we looking at in 100?
Here we've taken the shirt, the blouse. It's now she's been undressed and it's now separated. It's been placed on a piece of white paper and photographed. You can see when we remove the clothing, we don't tear it. So in this case, this appears to have been torn, and that's the way it was when she was on. Her arms were still in the blouse, but the front of it was completely torn.
From top to bottom?
That's right.
"101, is that a close-up of the tear?
It is.
"102, is that the back of her blouse?
Yes.
That's back up. And is there any discoloration similar to the bed sheets at the bottom of the blouse in the back?
Yes, there is some slight lightening of the fabric there, consistent with the lesion.
Image 103.
This is the bra that she still had on, but it was torn here in the front.
And 104.
That's just a close-up of the tear.
And was it still latched in the back,
Yes.
where it's typically taken on and off? That's what I'm talking about? 105, another picture of the bra.
Yes.
106, is that a picture of the tear?
Yes.
Same in 107?
Yes.
All right, now what are we looking at? 108, is there anything new you can describe for us?
Well, you can see she has not been cleaned here yet, and she still has some blood-tinged mucus smeared on the side of her face. You can now see those bruises a little bit more easily. You can see that there are really the whole extreme upper chest and lower neck area. This is really all one confluent.
And you say it's one confluent one. Can you break that? What does confluent mean?
Well, what's happened here is that there are multiple injuries here. There's multiple bruises, and they just kind of joined together. So this whole area, this whole upper area is discolored.
So that's when I ask you. So you can't put a number on it because they're kind of they're blended together. But can you still opine that it was caused by multiple traumas?
Yeah, so you can see, well, it depends on what's doing it. Let's say you have something, let's say you have, you press very hard with your fingers, and that's 5 separate bruises, possibly. Usually you don't see that. But you can see this is a separate contusion here, shoulder, upper chest. There's another one here. There's another one here. Here it seems to blend together. Given there's probably some decomposition change also contributing to that discoloration. However, when I look at her internally, it's not decomposition change. That's accounting for most things.
What causes a contusion, or what's a likely cause in this scenario?
Well, these are consistent with blows or pressure against the upper chest and neck.
Consistent with punches?
Correct.
Anything new that we haven't talked about in 109?
No, you can just see the change on the left arm. Again, that's not an injury. That's just skin slippage. You can see also the contusions on the thighs.
Anything new to talk about in 110? 111?
You can see, first of all, you can see some of that same discoloration that we saw in the groin area and on the arm, and you can see that that's also occurring under the arms. That's not an injury. There's an abrasion here, though, on her right upper arm, similar to the abrasion here on her left wrist, and that is an injury.
And on her upper arm, are we talking about like the inside of her upper arm as it's shown in this image?
Yes.
Is that consistent with that arm? That injury, would that be consistent with somebody squeezing that arm or holding it down?
It could be.
Anything new to talk about in 112?
Again, you can see that discoloration in the groin, and you can also see part of the abrasion here. So a symmetrical distribution of abrasion on the inner thighs and the buttocks.
What do you mean by symmetrical?
It appears to be almost a mirror image. So one side is similar to the other.
Is that consistent with pants being forcibly removed by hands?
It could be. Honestly, I don't know. Just looking at the pattern of abrasions here, I don't know what caused it.
Anything about 114 other than the discoloration you've said caused by skin to skin?
No, but you can also see, I'm sure we'll see it later, there's another abrasion on the right arm.
Is that that dark colored area at the
is.
bottom left of the image?
Yes.
115, that's a close-up of the discoloration.
Correct.
All right, 117, what are we looking at, and is there any signs of external injury?
Yes, now we're looking at her back, so she's face down now on the table. Now this discoloration that you see here, that's lividity. And you can see the small irregular areas of light and dark, and that's due to the fact that she was on those bedclothes. And in some areas there was more pressure against the skin than others, so the lividity is not as apparent. Here you can see that there's really no lividity, and that's because that part of her back was pressed evenly up against the bedclothes. You can see a small abrasion here, approximately the location of the clasp for her bra. You can see some more abrasion here under the left axilla, and some here on the left side of her torso.
What's an axilla?
Armpit.
Any new signs of trauma in 118?
Yes, so let's, again, here's the small abrasion that's right over the spinous processes of the thoracic spine. So that's an area that can be easily abraded. You see here, there's some linear abrasions here on the left side of her back. Some small abrasions here on the right side of her back. And then you can see here where the left arm was behind the back, and it's left an impression there. And so it's blanching. That means there's no lividity here because the arm was pressed firmly against the skin, but you can see lividity on either side. So again, this reddish, pinkish discoloration, that's lividity. That's not an injury. These are abrasions over the posterior aspect of the right hip, the upper left buttock, and then this, what I described as symmetrical abrasions of the lower buttocks and upper thighs. Those are injuries.
And could those injuries on her hips and buttocks be consistent with the forcible removing of pants and underwear?
They could be.
Anything new about 119?
No, this is just, again, a global view, I think, encompassing most of the injuries that we're seeing from the buttocks and the thighs.
120?
Again, just the lower portion of the injury on the left thigh.
Just a different perspective of her back in 121?
Correct.
Did you measure the injury in the middle of her back to scale in 125?
Yes,
And that's to centimeters, not to inches?
it's correct.
Closer up in 126?
Yes.
And what are we doing to scale in 128?
These are small abrasions on the right side of her back, and they're curved abrasions. That's consistent with fingernail injuries.
Close up in 129 of those curved abrasions?
Correct.
What are we measuring to scale here in 130?
That's the area of blanching that was caused by her arm being pressed against her back.
What's to scale in 131?
The abrasions of the posterior part of her upper right hip.
Close up in 132?
Yes.
Anything new in 133?
No, you can see the abrasion here on the inner aspect of the left upper arm right near the armpit, and then these this abrasion here on the left side.
And 134 is the abrasion on the back?
That's correct. That's a close up.
This, in image 138, is there any skin discoloration or any darkening in this image?
There is. This is most likely a contusion here, and these are small abrasions. This is the lateral aspect of the lower left hip.
Lateral means like the outside?
The side, yes.
Scale on 139, the abrasions?
Yes.
And what's the scale on 140?
This is the area of contusion and small, flesh and small abrasions.
141?
It's close up in the same area.
And is that multiple contusions and abrasions that we're talking about?
Well, there are multiple abrasions. You can see that some of them are quite small, less than a millimeter. Again, those could be scrapes from a fingernail. There could be something else. It could be a number of different things.
Anything new in 142?
No, this is just a sort of a global view of the injuries that we see on her buttocks and posterior on the thighs. Now, again, this area of discoloration here, that's that same type of phenomenon that we're seeing where there's been skin-to-skin contact, skin has been in place. The other injuries, though, these are true injuries, and I believe that they occurred while she was living. They have the characteristic appearance of an abrasion that occurs in an individual who is alive, rather than the type of abrasion you see that occurs after.
To scale on 144?
Yes.
To scale on 146?
Yes.
And 147, is this her left wrist?
Yes, you can see an area of contusion here on the left wrist, on the side of the fifth digit, and then there's another abrasion that we saw earlier on the thumb side of the wrist, the anterior wrist.
And having both fifth digit pinky and thumb side, two different injuries, is that consistent with possibly being held or gripped by hand?
It is.
And in 148,
That's a close-up of the wrist abrasion.
what are we looking at in 149?
We're looking at the left arm. There's contusion here, just below the elbow, and then we'll see this a little bit better. There's a abrasion, sort of a pattern abrasion on the upper arm.
And is this to scale on 150 for the upper arm contusion?
It is.
And some of the abrasion in the bottom of the image?
Yes.
Anything new in 151?
No, there's some faint contusion, faint abrasion there. Right forearm.
And 152?
Again, this is that discoloration that's you see at the base of the thumb, which, I can't say it's not a contusion. I can only say that I see this a lot in bodies, especially
What's the scale on 153?
this is the forearm. Again, there's a bruise there with little areas of abrasion.
Closer up in 154?
Yes.
155, what are you doing and why?
We're spreading the buttocks apart to expose the anus to look for evidence of injury to the uterus.
Any sign of injury?
No.
And you swabbed there too, correct?
Correct.
All right, in 157, anything new to talk about?
Yeah, now that this photograph, it looks like she has been cleaned off now. And as you will see later, there are these very small petechial hemorrhages over the face. And again, you can see these injuries that we described on the neck. You'll be able to see those a little bit better in some upcoming photographs.
Okay, 159 is an overall, again, cleaned up.
Yes.
Same for 160.
Yes.
All right, 161, can we see anything more clearly?
You can see some of these small petechial hemorrhages over the eyelids and the forehead and the cheeks on both sides.
What are we doing in 162?
Now we're looking at the membrane, the conduct cavity that covers the eye and the inner aspect of the eyelids. And that's an area that has a rich vascular supply. And we often see these little hemorrhages here in cases of strangulation. You can see them to some extent in a lot of different kinds of deaths. But they are classically found in cases of strangulation. Now, the very dark objects that you see there are actually particles of iodine. The petechial hemorrhages are these reddish dots you see here in this conjunctiva, the membrane lines of the eyelids.
And is the iris or the colored part of the eye, is that cloudy? And if it is, what does that mean, if anything?
Cloudiness of the eyes occurs as part of the process after death. So this is not inconsistent with a person who's been dead for a while.
And what's a while?
A day or so.
And 163?
Again, you can see these hemorrhages in the upper eyelid here, and there's a few of them here on the sclera, the white part of the eye itself.
And now her left eye in 164?
Yes, now here, sometimes if you get a lot of petechial hemorrhages, and they no longer look like separate little dots, they look now like just a fluid area of hemorrhage. So that's what we're seeing here in her lower eyelid. This darkening here, those are fluid petechial hemorrhages.
165, anything new?
You can see some of the hemorrhages here on the sclera, and again, the dark red petechial hemorrhages in the lower eye.
166?
Yeah, most of this are particles of eye makeup. I don't see these are the hemorrhages that I'm referring to here. The reddish ones, the black particles.
And what do we see in 167?
Now you'll see areas of discoloration. Now you'll also see areas. The coloration is often more pronounced if there's any type of a skin blemish. You'll see a person with acne, and they frequently will see this in cases of hanging, sometimes other types of asphyxiation. When there's compression of the neck and the blood return to the heart is obstructed, these vessels will burst, and they will produce these small hemorrhages. They're more pronounced in areas of blemishes. And so you can see some areas here are more pronounced, but these are fine little hemorrhages in the eyelids, and all over the forehead. These are all petechial hemorrhages.
168?
Now we're looking at the same. This is the right side of the face, and we can see those hemorrhages here on the cheeks, and to a lesser extent on the eyelid.
169?
Same thing for the left side of the face.
170?
We're looking again at those injuries of the upper chest. You can see these bruises here and the abrasions, and there's also some more bruises or contusions under her chin, which we'll see in a moment. There you go.
171?
All right, so now we're looking at the undersurface of her chin. Her head's been pulled back. You can see contusions here, these are bruises. Here's an abrasion. That abrasion is right over the larynx. So your larynx is commonly referred to as it's right there. It's cartilage, so it's somewhat pliable. That's about the area of her laryngeal cartilage. And you can see contusions here, small abrasions consistent with fingernails, more pinpoint contusions, large area of multiple contusions here, and little tiny abrasions on the skin.
And to scale at 172 is what?
That is sort of undersurface of the chin and upper anterior neck.
Closer still in 173?
Yes.
And 174?
That's just an overall showing the injuries that we've been describing.
175, what's the scale there?
Those are the contusions on her anterior front of her neck.
176?
Those are the contusions on the undersurface of her chin.
177?
More contusions on the left side of the neck with some small abrasions, and a larger contusion at the base of the neck on the left.
178?
We're measuring now the large areas of bruising on her right shoulder and right upper chest.
179?
This is the abrasion. You can see here that marbling again. That's a decomposition artifact. It's not an injury. This, however, is an abrasion of the arm. It's an unusual appearing abrasion. It appears to have some pattern, but I don't know what. I couldn't tell you what caused it.
180?
That's the abrasion on that line. The scale.
181?
The abrasion of the inner thigh on the left. Scale.
And 183?
Small bruise on the anterior left thigh near the groin.
184?
That's the left leg.
185?
Small contusions here over the left knee.
And is the knee something more consistent with accidental bumping when you're intoxicated?
Yes.
186?
Yeah, this shows the I think it's the left arm. You can see that abrasion, and it appears to be a pattern, but again, similar. It's not the same. It's similar to the appearance of the abrasions on the buttocks and the thighs, but I don't know what instrument or object could have caused that.
To scale in 187?
Yes.
And that's the pattern you're talking about?
Correct.
188?
We're looking at abrasion on the right hip.
Closer in 189?
Correct.
Scale in 190?
Yes.
191?
Now we're looking at the right thigh. There's the right knee. It's got a small scar there. It's got some small contusions here. Small bruises.
192? Anything new?
Yeah.
Nothing new in 193? What are we looking at in 201?
Now, the autopsy commences, the internal exam commences with what we call a line incision. So there's an incision that's made from the shoulder to the breastbone on either side, and then it continues on the midline abdomen through the skin. So you have what we call the Y incision. So the top part of the Y will be here, and that skin is pulled up. So what we've got is we've got skin and subcutaneous tissue and some muscle, and that's been pulled up over the chin. And now we're exposing the neck. Those are the strap muscles of the neck. And remember when I told you that discoloration of her neck was not due entirely to decomposition. Why can I say that? Well, look at the rest of it. Look at the muscle and the fat. Now is yellow and the muscle is red. So she's not so decomposed that this has changed. It looks relatively normal. As a matter of fact, if you exclude this, I wouldn't be able to tell you that this was a body early state of decomposition. That's why this hemorrhage here is not normal. That's trauma. That's injury.
And hemorrhage again means what?
Well, what's happened here is there's two small blood vessels have burst due to pressure, blood force trauma, and have caused accumulation of blood and some edema fluid in the soft tissue.
Now, is bleeding and swelling or edema, is that a process that goes on when one's alive and not when they're dead?
Well, for the most part, because we wouldn't refer to it as edema, it was post-mortem. However, there is accumulation of fluid post-mortem. So some of this fluid could be the result of injury and subsequent early decomposition. But decomposition alone will not give you this appearance.
What are we looking at in 208?
We're looking at the tongue. This is the epiglottis. This is the piece of tissue which closes off the airway when we swallow, so that food goes down the esophagus and not the trachea. These are the horns of the thyroid cartilage. So the thyroid cartilage is like a little cage which protects our larynx. It's very firm cartilage, but in a younger person, it can be fairly pliable. And the soft tissue here is still attached. You can see the hemorrhage, the dark red area, that has accumulated in that soft tissue, and that's a result of injury.
209?
We're just looked at that same specimen now, it's been turned over, so that's the front part.
215?
Now we're looking at the base of the larynx, and there's two major cartilages that compose the cage of the larynx. The top part is called the thyroid cartilage, and it has two horns on either side of it that rest for the most part against the spinal column. In this case, that was fractured on the right, and then there's also a fracture of the cricoid cartilage here on the right. Now, it's true that the horns of the thyroid cartilage can frequently be fractured by the removal during the autopsy itself. But that's not the case here. Number one, I suspected strangulation to begin with, so I was very careful in removing the neck organs. Number two, you don't get hemorrhage when you fracture the thyroid cartilage during the autopsy. You only get hemorrhage when that's fractured and the person's alive. So this is a fracture here of the cricoid cartilage, the lower part of the larynx. That occurs in a certain percentage of manual strangulation. I couldn't tell you how many. It's not unheard of. I've never seen one this severe.
And by strangulation, and specifically causing this type of injury, are we talking squeezing or pressure from an arm? Can you say anything?
It could be both. I mean, in this case, because I see those small contusions that are consistent with the pressure from fingers, and I see the semicircular abrasions, which are consistent with fingernail type injuries, and then I see this fairly extensive, complex fracture of the cartilage. It could be a combination of fingers, forearm, or even some other object pressed against the neck. So what happens is you have the cartilage here that you can feel in your neck that encases the larynx. And it gets pressed against the spinal column. So it gets compressed and squeezed. The cartilage is very pliable. But at some point, if you press it firmly enough, you will crack it. And that's what's happening.
219.
So normally, you would not see this surface of the cartilage. This is actually the fractured surface. We're looking at it on end. Normally, that's directly applied to this portion. So we're looking at the fractured portion of the cartilage.
222.
This is a photograph showing the fine petechial hemorrhages that you see in the upper eyelid and across the face.
223.
More petechial hemorrhages in the eyelid.
Same in 224.
Yes.
225.
Yes.
226.
Yes.
227.
Yes.
228.
Yes.
229.
Correct.
And in 230, what are we doing here?
We're looking at that abrasion on her back. This is after the autopsy.
Okay. And is that to scale with measuring tape?
It is
244.
the contusions on the base of the neck.
Scale of 245.
Yes.
249.
Yes, same thing.
All right. And did she have any injuries to her head?
Yes. During the course of the autopsy, in order to examine the skull and the brain, we made an incision through the scalp from just behind the ear over the top of the head. The scalp is then loosened from the skull and is pushed backward and forward. So we peel the scalp back over the forehead and over the back of the head. In this case, when we did that, there were a number of areas of hemorrhage in the skull. So very minor impacts. There's no skull injury itself, but I did not see any injuries.
Can the doctor retake the seat, Judge?
Yes.
All right, doctor, we were talking about injuries to her head, and I believe you had said several before we left. What is several?
Well, there were, I think, 4 or 5 areas. Let me.
Would it refresh your memory to review that specific part of your report?
Yes. 7 separately identifiable areas of hemorrhage.
And what parts of the head?
Predominantly the back of the head.
And when you say hemorrhage, again, is that bleeding?
Well, these are contusions on between the surface of the skull and the inner aspect of the scalp. So a lot of times a blow or pressure to the scalp will not result in a contusion that you can see from the surface, but when you separate the scalp from the skull, you will see a little area of hemorrhage or contusion on the undersurface of the scalp.
Is that consistent with being caused from blunt force trauma?
Yes.
All right. Now, ultimately, did you form an opinion about what caused Ms. Samsudean's death?
Yes, she's dead as the result of asphyxiation and a particular type of asphyxiation, manual strangulation.
All right. And does that mean like airway cutoff or something else?
Well, usually strangulation does not involve compromise of the airway itself. Even ligature strangulation or hanging usually do not result in obstruction of airflow. The mechanism of death is lack of oxygen to the brain. And that occurs when by one of two mechanisms. If the pressure is severe enough, you can actually occlude the carotid arteries. However, there are two of them, and they're fairly durable and difficult to occlude, especially manually. All you really need to do to affect an asphyxial death is to occlude the jugular veins, which are very flimsy, superficial veins in the neck, and they're easily collapsed by a ligature or by hand. And that will prevent the flow of blood into the brain because the blood cannot drain from the brain.
And the injury that she suffered with the fractured larynx, would that in and of itself have been fatal necessarily?
I don't think so.
And had she not been manually strangled to the point where she ceased to have blood supply to her brain, how does that injury play out? What would have happened to the larynx fracture?
Well, if she had sustained that fracture, let's say from a blow, an object, like a flashlight, she was struck in the neck with it, that would have been a painful injury. There would have been some swelling and hemorrhage in the area. It's possible that it could have resulted in occlusion of her airway at some point. But the larynx, the inner aspect of the larynx itself, when I examined it, was not particularly edematous. So I don't think airway obstruction in this case played a role in her death.
And did you measure her height and measure her weight at her time of death?
I did. At the time of the autopsy, she weighed 149 pounds and was 62.5 inches in length.
And how many feet in inches is that?
That's 5 feet, 2.5 inches.
And do you also take out and weigh the organs?
Yes.
And did you weigh her lungs?
I did.
And what did they weigh?
The right lung was 480 grams, and the left lung was 420 grams.
And for a woman of her age, what is a range, if there is a range of quote-unquote normal weight of lungs at time of death?
Well, I would say for a person her size, anywhere from 250 to 550.
And did you observe anything about the lungs that were out of the ordinary at all?
Her lungs were congested. That is, they had a lot of blood and fluid in them. But that's a very common finding at autopsy and is, I think, insignificant.
Can an injury such as what happened to her larynx cause fluid and whatnot to build up into the lungs?
I don't think by itself, unless there were a tremendous amount of hemorrhage, but that's not what I observed. So hemorrhage coming into the lungs from the outside, from the larynx, coming in through the airways, that's visible at an autopsy. That's not what I saw in this case. What I saw in this case was congested blood vessels within the lung itself, not inhaled blood.
And so you ruled out as a cause of death any problems with breathing due to the congestion you saw within her lungs?
I think the congestion that I see in her lungs is typical of what you see in a person who is dead from any number of reasons.
And how quickly can that build up as a result of the traumas such as what she suffered?
Pulmonary edema can occur in a matter of seconds.
And could you pass from strangulation even quicker than that process that you just described?
Well, a person can die from strangulation in a relatively short period of time.
What does that mean?
Well, There aren't too many experiments that are done now, but in the past, there have been experiments of occlusion of the blood supply to the brain by placing a blood pressure cuff around the neck. And some of those individuals lost consciousness in as little as 10 to 12 seconds. But of course, it was never completed to death. But it's generally accepted that a minute or 2 minutes is enough.
Did you determine a manner of death?
The manner of death is homicide.
And what does that mean to a forensic pathologist, as the terminology homicide as opposed to how I might use it?
That means that the death was the result of the action of another individual.
What are the other options you have as a medical examiner?
Suicide, that is, an individual takes an action which causes their own death. Accident, or sometimes we can't tell, undetermined. That could mean that there simply isn't enough evidence to say why the person died. For instance, skeletal remains without evidence of trauma. And then the remaining option for manner of death is natural. That is, a natural disease process caused the person to die.
So the other four manners of death you ruled out.
That's correct.
And have you offered all of your opinions today in a reasonable degree of medical certainty?
Yes.
No other questions?
Cross-examination.
Thank you, Your Honor. Good morning, Doctor.
Good morning.
I want to start off by asking you a few questions about loss of consciousness from carotid occlusion, okay?
All right.
You testified that, I guess, years ago they did some studies where they put blood pressure cuffs around the necks of, I think it was young soldiers to see, or maybe prisoners to see.
I'm not sure who the subjects were, but they were considered to be volunteers.
Right. And the point was that they generally lost consciousness in you said around 10 to 20 seconds.
Correct.
Okay. And then you said the generally accepted idea is how long to lose consciousness?
I think that period of time.
Now, in that case, you're dealing with basically a perfect occlusion where it's totally cut off on both sides at the same time.
That's correct.
And because each side of your neck has blood supply to the brain, and if one side is open, you would be getting blood flow to the brain, just less, right?
Correct.
Okay. So if you have kind of an imperfect closure, then the amount of time to lose consciousness, if you lose consciousness at all, could vary.
Certainly.
Okay. So if someone doesn't have, if both sides are not perfectly closed, or there's a struggle, the time that it takes to lose consciousness could be far more than 10 to 20 seconds.
Yes.
Okay. And in this particular case, you don't know how long it took for this individual to lose consciousness.
I do not.
Okay. And I wanted to talk about a struggle. If someone was being manually strangled, as you theorize here, would they be able to offer some resistance?
Well, it depends on the condition of the individual.
Okay. But certainly it's not a situation where they're going to be automatically rendered unconscious or paralyzed or something like that, as we just discussed.
I think that's a fair statement.
And you're theorizing in this case that hands or something was placed on this woman's throat.
Yes.
And in that time period before she lost consciousness, it would be possible for her to move, to make noise, things like that.
Yes.
And the damage you saw to the larynx doesn't preclude making sound, does it?
Well, I'm not sure. Honestly, I don't know, because none of the people that I examine are making any sounds.
I understand. I hope not.
So I'm not certain whether a person. It would seem to me that it's possible that voice could be impaired by that injury, but I can't say for certain.
Okay. And certainly nothing that you saw would suggest that this person was otherwise paralyzed or something like that and unable to move while this was being done.
No.
Did you look at any pictures of the crime scene?
I did.
Did you see any obvious signs of a struggle that had taken place?
No, the bedclothes were somewhat disorganized, but other than that, I I did not notice anything that I would say was indicative of a struggle.
Now, one of the things that you did, or I'm sorry, maybe you didn't do it, someone in your staff did, was put bags over the hands before transporting them to the medical examiner's office.
That's right.
And then you testified that you inspected the body with a light and then also clipped the fingernails.
Yes.
And are you looking for anything that could be under the fingernails?
Yes.
Okay. And it's possible that if someone, a decedent is scratched, her assailant, that there might be skin or some other material under her nails.
Yes.
Okay. And that's one of the things you were looking for in this case.
Well, I'm not looking for anything in particular. I am just collecting that
Let me
evidence
rephrase it.
to submit. So whatever is there, whatever someone wants to look for.
Let me rephrase. When I said you, I should have meant kind of the office of the medical examiner and the people that are trying to solve this mystery. They're potentially looking to see if there's any skin under the nails of the decedent.
Well, I just make a minor correction. It's not the medical examiner's office which is doing that. We are collecting the specimen, sometimes at our own, under our own initiative, and sometimes at the request of law enforcement. But that material is not analyzed by our office. We do not even usually know the results of such analysis.
Right, and in this particular case, do you know the results of the analysis?
I do not.
Okay. So you don't know if anything was collected from under the nails?
Well, I don't know what the results of the analysis of those nails was.
Now, you testified on direct examination that there were fingernail marks on her neck.
Yes.
Do you know whose fingernails those were?
No.
Would you expect to find, if they were her own fingernails, would you expect to find skin under her nails based on the type of injury you observed?
I would say that it's possible.
I know when you talked about this case with us several months ago, and again today, you mentioned that you smelled an odor about the body when you first began examining it.
Yes.
And you said it was a smell of cleaning products.
That's right.
I think you described it initially as a light smell. It wasn't a heavy or overwhelming smell.
That's correct.
And you, in fact, characterized it as being kind of like someone had just gotten out of a shower, or kind of a clean smell.
Yes.
Okay. Does bleach destroy DNA?
Well, I believe it does, yes.
How about chlorine-based bleach? Or chlorine cleaning? I guess chlorine-based bleach isn't correct. Does chlorine cleaning product destroy DNA?
I believe it does denature DNA, yes.
Would you find evidence of denatured DNA if you looked for it? Sorry, would you find evidence of denatured DNA if you looked for it?
Well, I don't know. I mean, that's not something that I personally do.
Okay. When DNA becomes denatured, will it still show up under a fluorescent light source?
Well, I don't believe it's the DNA itself which is fluorescing. But again, I don't honestly know what the effect of cleaning a skin surface with a bleach solution would be as far as recovery.
Right. I thought denatured meant the proteins broke down, but I was wondering if you knew if they would still fluoresce.
I do not.
Okay. And I want to talk about that. The alternate light source that you examined the body under, that's to detect certain proteins, you said semen and saliva.
Primarily, yes.
Okay. And in this case, the alternative light source did not reveal any areas with semen or saliva.
Well, I did not see any areas that fluoresced.
Correct. And ultimately, you didn't, and you know the results of the swabs that you submitted for testing?
My understanding is that the defendant's DNA was recovered from a breast swab.
Okay. And how about, was any semen or anything was any semen found on the body?
I do not know.
Okay. So do you not know the results of all the swabs that were sent in?
I do not.
Okay. As far as, let's talk about the breast swab. Did you yourself swab the breasts?
I did.
Okay. And you described that you did the nipple, the areola, and then an inch area around the area?
That's correct.
Okay. And then you combined the swab from the left breast and the right breast and did one test?
Well, again, my role ends with the swab.
Okay. So you don't know if subsequent to your gathering the swabs, how they were tested?
I do not.
Okay. And are you familiar with the concept of touch DNA?
I am.
Can you tell us what touch DNA is?
Touch DNA is simply a transfer of genetic material between individuals when there is contact, either skin to skin or mucous membrane to skin or mucous membrane to mucous membrane.
Okay. And so can DNA be transferred by touching an article of clothing that has DNA on it?
I suppose it can, yes.
Okay. Do you know how the DNA that you talked about got where you found it?
No.
And do you know how long it had been there?
No.
And you're not able to say whether it was saliva, are you?
No.
Okay. In fact, okay. So it. In addition to your training in medicine and forensic pathology in the various degrees, do you have a background in, forensic toxicology?
Well, all forensic pathologists need to have a background in forensic toxicology. In my opinion, some of my colleagues prefer to defer to a toxicologist to make decisions about whether a substance caused the death. I prefer to do that myself.
Okay. So certainly it would be within your area of expertise and experience to talk about forensic toxicology.
Yes.
Okay. And you feel comfortable doing that, of course.
I do.
Okay. So I wanted to ask you a little bit about the toxicology results that were done, the toxicology testing and the results. You're familiar with the results in this case?
Yes, and I have them right here.
Okay. The ethanol, that was the only kind of chemical or controlled substance that was found in the decedent's blood, right?
That's correct.
There may have been caffeine or something. But
The screening process, which is very inclusive, which will discover most illicit drugs and many other substances, found only in ethanol and caffeine.
Okay. So, yeah. And caffeine is, as I know firsthand, a stimulant, right?
Yes.
Okay. Nothing. You don't suspect that caffeine or alcohol played a direct role in death, do you?
No,
It's not a case of alcohol or caffeine poisoning, nothing like that.
I do not believe so.
Okay. Now the 0.229 grams per deciliter, I want to make sure that we don't relate that with what I think most people might think of when they think of blood alcohol levels, and that's like the DUI context. When you're checking this, when this blood is tested, is the whole blood tested or is it the serum blood that's tested?
It's a whole blood test.
Okay, which means that the solids have not been separated out yet.
That's correct.
Okay. So, is there a difference in the readings between whole blood and serum blood when you're looking at alcohol?
There is.
And can you explain briefly what that difference is?
I believe that the serum level is slightly lower than the whole blood level. But in this case, I think the ethanol level is irrelevant to the death.
I'm asking if you're okay. So, but when you're familiar with ethanol metabolism, right? The general idea. There is an absorptive phase in which the person's blood alcohol levels would be rising, right? As they consume the alcohol and it enters their body.
That's correct.
Then it would, at some point when it stopped drinking, it would peak or plateau, right?
Yes.
And then it would begin to be eliminated by the body and the levels would start to decrease.
That's correct.
When a person dies, those processes would stop, though, correct?
Yes. There is, however, some post-mortem production of alcohol.
Okay.
It's a small amount. I can't say it didn't contribute to this.
Okay. And when you say a small amount in relation to a number like 0.229, what is a small amount? 0.001?
Usually I wouldn't expect more than a 0.05 accumulation from decomposition, but there have been reports of more.
Okay.
But I would not expect it in this case to be more than 0.05.
Now that's the body producing alcohol, but the body doesn't continue to metabolize alcohol once the heart has stopped pumping, right?
That's correct.
Okay. So we would expect that that 0.229 number is fixed at the time of death.
Yes.
Are you familiar with the concept of retrograde extrapolation?
Yes.
And just kind of briefly, is that the idea that you could try to figure out when or how much someone's had to drink based on time and a number like what you have here?
Yes.
Okay. And is that something that's scientifically accepted by forensic toxicologists as a reliable method?
No.
Okay. Kind of like you were talking about the body temperature. If it fits, then it might be helpful, but otherwise it's not always accurate or reliable.
Well, I was being facetious. It's not reliable. I mean, it has been used, and I have seen toxicologists make those retrograde analyses, and I've also seen the same toxicologists say, well, it's not really reliable.
So if you knew anything about how much this person had to drink, when they stopped drinking, could that help you estimate the time of death?
I don't think it would give me any more of an estimation of the time of death than the other external evidence does.
Okay. And you said that someone with that blood alcohol level would be, your word was drunk?
Yes, sir.
One of the things I wanted to ask you about is in your physical examination and in the work that you did, you didn't see any signs of sexual intercourse, did you?
I did not.
And you can't necessarily rule it out, correct?
That's correct.
But you also didn't see anything that was consistent with sexual intercourse?
Correct.
Okay. And when you looked under you didn't find any evidence of saliva or anything like that on the mouth or anything like that under the alternate light source?
I did not see any fluorescence using the alternate light source.
Did you see, before clipping the decedent's fingernails, any broken nails?
I'm not sure if any nails were broken. She did have the nail polish was chipped.
Okay. But as far as like a torn or broken nail that you might expect if it was snagged or caught on something, you don't recall seeing anything?
I don't believe so.
The hair in the ring that we saw several pictures of, do you know if that hair was submitted for testing?
Well, again, our office submits the evidence that we collect to law enforcement, and what they do with it, I don't know.
And that was my question. Was the hair submitted for testing?
Yes.
Okay. Did you do any inspection of the hair to determine if you thought it would be likely to yield anything useful to you?
No.
Are you familiar with the kinds of things you can learn from a hair forensically?
No, hair analysis is outside of my area of expertise.
Okay. Do you know whether hair can have DNA in it?
Yes, it can.
Okay. And generally that there are tests that can be done to hair to determine chemicals that someone's ingested, things like that. I mean, you generally know that. Okay. But your department would not conduct those tests?
No.
Okay. Now, again, you didn't see any signs of defensive wounds on the body, did you?
Well, the wounds on the arms, I mean, those could be considered defensive.
The abrasions?
Yes.
Okay. How about but you didn't, again, no broken nails, no trauma to the knuckles, things like that, right?
There was some minor trauma to the hand, but whether or not that's a defensive injury, I think that's very subjective.
Right. And in fact, on direct testimony, you testified there was no sign of trauma to the knuckles. That what you observed was, I think, post-mortem.
Correct.
Do you subject the clothing to an alternate light source to see if there's any proteins on the clothing?
No.
To your knowledge, does another department or another group do that?
Well, they may. The reason that we do the alternate light source on the body itself is because we're going to destroy that evidence during the course of our examination. The clothing, however, we're not going to destroy. So we submit that intact to law enforcement, and they will do whatever analyses they feel appropriate.
Okay. Now, you talked a little bit about some of the patterns of abrasions, and we were talking about that briefly. You talked about some patterns of abrasions on the lower body. Mr. J asked you if that could be from a sexual intercourse with someone wearing a belt. Your testimony was that you're not sure what caused that pattern of abrasion.
That's correct.
Okay. And that's just, I mean, sex with someone wearing a belt, that's just a conjecture, essentially.
Yes.
You would not testify to a degree of medical certainty whether or not this person had sex with anyone.
That's correct.
And you're not able to testify to a degree of medical certainty how the bruises or abrasions that you observed came to be, are you?
Not those patterned abrasions on the thighs and buttocks, but the injuries to the neck are a different story.
But you're not able to tell us to a degree of medical certainty who inflicted any of those injuries, things like that.
That's correct.
Okay. I want to talk a little bit more about the neck and the observations that you made. You testified that there's, I guess, several types of strangulation: manual strangulation, I guess ligature strangulation, and then I forget what the third type. Hanging. Okay. So manual strangulation is with the hands or an object, right? And ligature is with a cord or something like that?
Yes.
Okay. Are you familiar with the concept of erotic asphyxiation?
Yes.
Can you tell us what that is?
Are you referring to autoerotic asphyxiation? Or
Auto means by yourself, right? So
you, with someone else? Right. Well, some individuals feel that sexual pleasure is enhanced if there is a partial asphyxiation.
And have you had occasion to investigate cases where that partial asphyxiation went awry and the person passed away?
I have not personally had a case in which another individual caused the death. I have had cases in which the individual caused their own death as a result of what we term autoerotic asphyxiation.
And that's essentially someone who perhaps hung themselves or did something to get to a near, to a degree of strangulation and then was unable to get out before they died?
Yes, usually individuals who do this will have some type of an escape mechanism so that when they momentarily lose consciousness, whatever apparatus they're using to apply pressure to their neck is released. But sometimes it doesn't work. They lose consciousness and the pressure is not released and they asphyxiate.
And now, and I think we talked about this a little bit before, setting aside, erotic aspects of it, is it possible to, by massaging the carotid area or the carotid, I guess, processes, affect the heart and other vital processes?
Yes, carotid body massage will lower the heart rate and blood pressure.
And can you just tell me generally what the carotid body is? So,
a carotid body is simply an area in the carotid arteries on both sides of the neck which senses blood pressure and controls heart rate.
And that's something that you could actually do to yourself. You could actually almost induce unconsciousness in yourself by applying pressure to that area, correct?
Yes.
Okay. Now, are you familiar with, I think I'm going to probably mispronounce it, but vagal inhibition?
Yes.
And that's when pressure is applied to like the carotid sinus area, an area below the carotid that can have deleterious effects on the human body? Or
well, vagal stimulation, again, will affect the heart rate, and it can, in some rare cases, produce a fatal arrhythmia. There are some people that speculate that strangulation is really more complex than the model that I've explained to you, and that is asphyxiation. There are some cases, and I've had several myself, in which I think that the mechanism of the death was due to either vagal or phrenic nerve stimulation. Those are cases in which usually the act is witnessed, and the person is seen to not be dead immediately, and then subsequently suffers an arrest.
so what, and to kind of maybe put that in more simple terms, what happens is whatever, it can be a sudden blow or tremendous pressure applied to the area, and then death sometime later as a result of arrhythmia?
Yes, but it would be brief, seconds later, not minutes or hours.
And that can be caused by a blow to the carotid area.
Well, I've never seen it. I've never seen one described by a blow, but I have seen and personally had several cases of people placed in chokeholds. And in one case, the person was just horsing around with a friend, put him in a chokehold, and he fell, coughed a few times, and collapsed.
Did that person pass away in the example that you just explained?
Yes. However, in those cases, you don't see the injury to the neck and to the laryngeal cartilage that I see in this case.
Right, but it's but certainly, and the amount of force that you saw would be an amount of force that could also trigger this situation, right?
Well, yes. I mean, I suppose it's possible that we could be dealing with that, but I would sort of be missing the forest for the trees if I didn't note the fact that her larynx is essentially crushed.
Sure.
And
we're talking about tremendous pressure to the neck area.
Yes.
Right, and that's what I'm asking is, in addition to, I guess, manual strangulation, tremendous pressure to the neck area could also trigger this alternate process.
Yes. However, I can tell from the fact that there are these petechial hemorrhages all over her face and her eyelids that there's a component of asphyxiation here. There's a component of a derangement of blood flow to the head.
Right, and I guess where I was going with this is that it's possible, as you mentioned yourself, that manual strangulation is a more complicated process than just no blood to the brain, that other processes are involved and can play a role, is I guess where I'm...
I think that's a fair statement.
And sometimes there can be a delay from the injury until the death, albeit a short period of time.
Correct.
The injuries that you testified to on the head, these were minor, you said minor impacts to the head that didn't damage the skull or the brain?
Yes.
Okay. And you observed some injuries to the knees and other places on the body that you testified could be associated with just staggering or stumbling?
Yes.
Okay. Now, when you said that all the bruises appeared to be in the same general time frame, can you give us a period of time in which you think those bruises appeared? Is it 24 hours, 48 hours?
You mean before death?
Yes, sir.
I'd say less than 24 hours.
Okay. So if this was, early morning, it could be 24 hours preceding. Those bruises could have occurred in that time frame?
Yes.
And so within that 24-hour period, can you separate out one bruise as being older or newer than another bruise, or they're just within that time period?
I can't separate them.
Okay. For example, the bruises to the knees that could be from staggering might have occurred at a different time than other bruises but still within that same 24-hour window.
I think so.
Now, your evaluation, I mean, you said something that I thought was really important, that it didn't, if something was not reliable, it didn't have a place in forensic medicine. Your forensic medicine is objective. You're not relying on the subjective explanation that you're given of what occurred.
Well, that's a controversial issue. Actually, forensic pathology is the practice of medicine. So it is a bit different from a DNA analyst or a fingerprint analyst. So I'm not sure if that answers your question.
You're not interviewing people to find out more about the subject. You're not talking to the decedent's relatives. You're not getting like a medical history like you would do if you were a general practitioner, doctor, things like that. You're looking.
That's absolutely false. Actually, I do that every day. Yes, I do. I talk to people. I talk to family. I ask about a deceased individual's state of mind. I ask about the medical history, their known medical history. That is the medical history that's documented by a physician, or the medical history that they give their friends and families by complaining.
Then, doctor, I must have missed your doing that in this case. Did you do that in this case?
I did not, but that's part of the scene examination. Okay. That's what we do. That's why I said that forensic pathology is not autopsy pathology. That's not the way I practice forensic pathology.
Did you yourself interview anyone in this case?
I did not.
Okay. I think that was probably a better question, was did you yourself interview anyone in this case? Or did you just do what you testified to? I guess I was asking if we missed any part of your process.
No.
Now, when you perform the autopsy, is law enforcement present with you?
Sometimes.
In this case, do you recall if law enforcement was present with you?
I think at some point they were, but certainly not during the whole procedure.
And the information you had about the possible cause of death, was that relayed to you by law enforcement before you began your examination?
No, you mean that's my observation of the scene.
Okay.
I see those photographs before I do the exam.
Right. So but you didn't go to the scene yourself. Your assistants gave you a picture that they gathered.
Yes.
And those are, assistants. Those are technicians that work with you.
They're death investigators. Yes.
And so that's how you would have come to see the crime scene and the layout of the room and whether things were, whether there was signs of a struggle like we discussed earlier.
Yes, both the photographs taken by the what we call medico-legal death investigators from our office, and then also I reviewed the photographs taken by the crime scene analysts.
Now, your testimony was the injury to the larynx, the windpipe, would not have, in your opinion, been fatal in and of itself.
That's correct.
Mr. J asked about the bruises that were observed in the neck area, whether that could have been caused by punches. Do you remember that conversation?
Yes.
I suppose it could have been caused by punches, but do you believe that it was caused by punches to the front chest or by like a forearm or hands pressing down?
Well, I think it could be a combination of both.
Okay. If somebody was posting their weight on their hands in that area, could that cause the kind of bruising that you saw?
I think it would take a little bit more than that.
So you think there was a striking component, or could weight alone cause that?
I think it's unlikely that weight alone would cause that, although weight with a struggle of the victim could possibly do that.
Okay. The X-ray that you did initially didn't reveal any broken bones or anything like that, did it?
Did not.
Are there, and I think we talked a little bit in your deposition about the hyroid. Is that a bone?
It is.
Okay. And in this case, that bone was not broken.
It was not.
Okay. I think when we talked about this, you said that people who don't necessarily do this for a living put greater weight in whether or not the hyoid bone is intact than you do. Is that a fair summary of that discussion?
You mean as it relates to strangulation?
Yes, sir.
Well, the hyoid is, popularly characterized as the telltale marker of strangulation. But actually, in most cases of strangulation, the hyoid is intact. And it's very flexible in a young person. It actually is 3 separate bones joined together in a U shape. And, it might be fractured, it might not. All of these injuries that we see in the neck, and they really don't cause the death. The cause of death is something that we can't see. And that is occlusion of the blood vessels.
Okay. So while people might commonly associate a broken hyoid bone with being strangled, that does not, in and of itself, the fact that the bone wasn't broken doesn't rule it out.
Correct.
And although here the bone was not broken, that did not cause you did not change your opinion in any way based on everything else you saw.
Correct.
Specifically the cartilage horns and the damage to the larynx cage and that whole area, the thyroid area, being so damaged.
That's correct.
I just have a few last questions. I want to clarify the difference between the word or the usage of the word choke versus strangulation. Choke implies asphyxiation, the loss of air. Is that correct?
Choking in medical terminology, especially in forensic pathology, refers to obstruction of the airway by a foreign body.
Which causes a loss of oxygen.
Correct.
And if a person died from choking, that would be from loss of oxygen.
That's correct.
Okay. And then strangulation is basically the restriction of blood flow to the brain?
Well, as we discussed earlier,
Among others. Yeah.
there may be other mechanisms involved, but that appears to be primarily the mechanism of the death is asphyxiation due to restriction of blood flow to the brain.
But from they're different means of bringing about an end. They're not interchangeable. Strangulation and choking are not interchangeable terms medically.
No. In the popular vernacular, you might hear a person say that they were choked or they choked another person. That's not a terminology that we would use.
Okay.
Choking refers to obstruction of the airway by a foreign body. I suppose another individual could put a foreign body in an airway, and you could say that person was choked.
Or like choking on food.
Right, but we don't use that terminology anywhere in the description of strangulation. It's completely different.
So in this particular case, there was you're not aware of any obstruction to the airway.
Well, there may have been some transient obstruction to the airway because the trachea could have been partially collapsed. That is, the trachea starts just below the cricoid cartilage. And although we didn't show you a picture of that, it was fractured in several places.
So what you mean by transient is it could have been compressed while there was force, and when the force was moved back to its original position or close to its original position.
Exactly.
Okay. And then for whatever period it was compressed, there might have been reduced or no airflow, but that just passed when the force was removed.
Correct.
Okay. And based on what you saw, the interior of the larynx and the cartilage, you didn't suspect that there would be any impact to the airway once pressure was removed.
That's correct.
And you don't believe that choking played any role in this death?
No.
Did you see any signs of obvious trauma to the breast area on the decedent?
I believe there was a small contusion. It was just below the right breast, on the right side of the body.
I don't think we did. We see a picture of that when we were going through the slides. Do you recall?
Well, there were many contusions. I'm not sure. I think we did, actually, on the right side of the body wall. Yes.
And for that, and you can't say how that contusion came to be there,
No.
or what caused it,
No.
or how long it was there.
Only that it appeared to be the same age as the other injuries.
Generally within that 24-hour window.
I think so.
Okay. And that would be the same of all the contusions. You can't say what exactly caused them,
Correct.
or when, except for this 24-hour period, they were first caused.
Well, only in the context of the contusions around the neck, which are markers of force, which indicate strangulation. And so I think that those are inflicted shortly before death.
Right. I'm talking about the contusion, and I should clarify. I don't, other than the contusions to the neck, the smaller contusions, the 1.5, 1 inch contusions that we discussed or that we were visible throughout, other than the neck, you can't say other than within 24 hours when they occurred.
That's correct.
And you can't relate them to whether they occurred at roughly the same time as the damage to the chest, or hours earlier, or almost a day earlier.
That's correct.
Okay.
Can one be strangled even to death without leaving any visible signs of injury on that person?
Yes.
Can you explain that?
Well, I personally have had more than one case in which an individual was intoxicated, or in one case simply gave up and did not struggle. The reason that we see the marks that we see when people are strangled is because overwhelming force is used and they're struggling for their lives. So more force is used than is necessary. It takes only a few pounds of pressure per square inch to close those jugular veins. And you don't have to leave any marks. There doesn't have to be any bruising. There doesn't have to be any appearance of trauma whatsoever. Fortunately, for people in my position, usually there is. Usually the victim fights back and struggles, or the perpetrator uses more force than is necessary and leaves those telltale signs.
And how would you describe the difference in force necessary to strangle somebody to death without leaving a mark versus crushing a larynx?
Well, you don't have to crush the larynx at all to affect a asphyxial death in an individual, and that's evidenced by the fact that we see quite a few asphyxial deaths due to hanging, and in the vast majority of those cases, there's no injury whatsoever to the neck.
And in cross-examination, you indicated that you did take into account the photographs that were taken by the investigator of Ms. Samsudean's apartment.
Yes.
And that there appeared, as far as her property and belongings, to be no signs of a struggle.
That's correct.
Is that in any way relevant to your consideration of cause and manner of death, given the evidence of her body?
No.
Is it necessary for somebody to offer resistance when being choked?
No.
Forensically speaking, can you even say whether she had an opportunity to resist?
Only, I believe the severity of the injuries implies resistance. However, having said that, could she have been unconscious and had the same outcome? Yes, that's possible.
And she did have injuries to the back of her head, correct?
Correct.
And the injuries to her throat and shoulder, is that necessarily from front, or could any of those injuries been inflicted from behind?
They could have been inflicted from behind.
So if she had come to the door, hypothetically, the attacker could have attacked her at her door and then subsequently attacked her from behind.
I don't see why not.
Forensically speaking. Okay. And she was 5'2"
Yes.
and a half?
Yes.
I don't want to take that half away. And she was at nearly 3 times the legal limit at the time of her passing of alcohol if she were to drive?
Yes.
And you had a conversation about bleach or other cleaning substances and their effect on degrading DNA evidence. Remember that?
Yeah.
Can also just the act of having fluid poured over somebody or something wash away or move the DNA by the motion of the fluid?
Yes.
And you testified that there was some like clothy debris in her pubic area.
Yes.
And is that consistent with her body possibly being cleaned with something?
Yes, it could be.
Would that also help remove DNA, particularly if there was already liquid on the body?
It would.
Particularly if it was already cleaning solution or bleach on the body?
Yes.
Now, are you familiar with the types of cells that can leave behind the nuclear material that can be tested for STR-DNA?
Yes.
And does that include epithelial or skin cells?
It does.
Now, does it necessarily mean that anytime somebody touches something that they will be leaving behind epithelial cells with nuclear DNA?
It does not.
Can you explain that?
Well, on our skin surfaces, the cells that we lose on a continual basis are superficial epithelial cells that become keratinized, and they lose their nucleus over a period of time. The cells in the lower layers do have nuclear material, but the cells on the very surface, especially if you think of something like a calloused surface of the skin, they've lost their nuclear material.
And to get to those skin cell levels below the top that don't have nuclear material, could tearing apart fabric like a bra cause that?
Possible.
Now, you had said, I believe, on direct examination that the injuries on the inside of her legs were not inconsistent with having intercourse with somebody that had a belt with stuff on it, more or less, correct?
Yes.
All right. So I just want to be clear. Is that conjecture, or are you saying that it's just not inconsistent if that is the history given?
Well, you have to look at the case in the context that you have. I mean, I have a young woman. She's been assaulted. She's nearly naked in her bed. She's wrapped in a comforter. I'd be an idiot not to entertain the idea of a sexual assault. So in looking at her body and those curious abrasions, I attempted to find an answer, a solution. What could have caused those abrasions? And that was one idea.
Okay. And so it's just not inconsistent if that is the history given.
Correct.
But, for example, there are things that would be inconsistent, like a history of her being shot. Did you see any indication of her being shot with a gun?
No.
So there are things that are inconsistent with your forensic findings, and then there can be things that aren't inconsistent. Is that fair?
That's true.
Okay. Now, you had a discussion about erotic asphyxiation with defense counsel?
Yes.
And you ruled out accidental death, correct?
I did.
And can you rule out the theory of erotic asphyxiation based on the totality of the evidence on Ms. Samsudean's body?
I believe so.
And why?
Because of the overwhelming number of injuries and the tremendous force that was applied to her neck.
And you had some discussions about the timing of the injuries with defense counsel?
Yes.
And you did take microscopic slides of 2 areas of injury?
I did.
And you didn't see any signs of healing?
That's correct. Those areas of abrasion.
Right.
I did not.
And where were they?
They were on the thighs.
Right. Thank you.
Additional questions for you.
All right.
Could the blows to the victim's head cause her to become unconscious?
That's possible.
Is there anything that can tell you whether the blows to the head occurred before or after the manual strangulation?
They occurred before she died.
Did or could the trauma to the skull cause unconsciousness or death to the victim?
I think it's unlikely that those blows would result in death. They could result in unconsciousness, but I think that's unlikely, but still possible.
How much strength does it take to cause strangulation?
Well, that depends on who's being strangled. So that's why we don't find many muscular men dying of manual strangulation. If a person doesn't resist, or if they're very weak, or if they're incapacitated, it takes very little pressure on the neck to accomplish a strangulation.
Are there any conclusions that can be made based on the way the blouse looks that indicate what the blouse was torn with?
I can't answer that question because that's outside of my area of expertise.
Could the abrasions on the inner thighs and buttocks be from the intense scrubbing of a sponge or other cleaning tool?
It's possible.
Thank you. Any follow-up on behalf of the state of Florida? Any follow-up on behalf of the defendant?
Doctor, you talked on redirect examination about DNA being basically washed off the body. Would you then, would it be possible then to find that washed off DNA if it had fallen onto towels or comforters underneath the subject? Would you expect to find it there, perhaps?
I suppose that's possible.
And you said that you had tried to theorize how those abrasions could have gotten there. I think you just answered one of the jurors' questions that it could have been from scrubbing, and then you offered an explanation about wearing a belt. What other explanations did you come up with?
I couldn't really.
So just, you don't think like normal jeans or a buckle or something like that couldn't have caused it?
Well, I don't see how.
Okay. Now, when you testified on direct examination about the blows, the head, you said there was no signs of damage to the skull or to the brain.
Yes.
Okay. Can you have unconsciousness with no forensic signs?
That is the definition of a concussion.
Okay. Did you look at the brain to see if there was any signs of a concussion in this case?
Well, a concussion wouldn't have any signs.
I thought that was the Will Smith movie. I thought that was...
Well, that's a chronic traumatic encephalopathy, a different animal. No, you can have a concussion with transient loss of consciousness with absolutely no visible changes.
In your opinion, did you think that whatever caused Ms. Samsudean to lose consciousness?
Well, I don't know. I interpreted those contusions as part and parcel of the other injuries that I saw and indicated to me a struggle.
Okay. But you would agree that as far as when they occurred, they could have occurred up to 24 hours earlier?
That's possible, yes.
And so you're saying there would be no way for you to rule out that someone lost consciousness forensically with that type of injury?
I couldn't rule it out, no.
Okay. But you also don't think you don't believe that blow would have caused death?
No.
Okay. And certainly you didn't crack the skull or do any damage to the skull underneath it?
Not that I could see.
Okay. And when you're saying that the blow to the head occurred before she passed away, that's based on the observations that you talked about earlier as far as what the injury looked like and what it would look like if it was inflicted post-mortem? Is that what okay. So again, you don't know when it was inflicted, just prior to death? That's
correct.
Okay. Again, so that could have been seconds or hours before?
Yes.
And you said that it takes very little pressure to strangle someone if they're not resisting?
That's right.
But in this case, you believe that there was resistance?
I think so, based on the multitude of injuries.
and then it probably becomes much more difficult to quantify the amount of strength or pressure required.
Well, yes, I think that's a fair statement.
I don't have any more questions.